But I do think that the danger of nuclear war, the likelihood of nuclear war is rising. This kind of nuclear use is not unprecedented. In fact, it's the only precedented form of nuclear use, is nuclear use to try to end a conventional war. You start to get in a situation in which you may view the risks of using them as being lower than the risks of not using them.
Putin may soon be doubling down on violence as he sees it as his only option.
Russia's ally Belarus has also threatened to deploy nuclear weapons if Poland or Lithuania do so.
And to grant to Belarus the status of nuclear country. This is very dangerous.
Our airspace will be closed to every Russian plane, and that includes the private jets of oligarchs too.
We are asking for the no-fly zone. We are saying in response that it will trigger World War III. But what is the alternative, Mr. Prime Minister?
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So guys, we need to chat. We need to chat now, and you got to give me your ear for 15 minutes if possible. Please stick with me to the end of this video. There's a lot of stuff that we have to talk about. If you can only make it through the first 60 seconds, I beseech you to keep your ear to the ground every hour on the hour to this Ukraine-Russia situation, because we are so close to the button being pushed. We're clearly at Defcon 2. The United States government will say that their nuclear alert status hasn't changed, just like Ned Price said yesterday, but you cannot believe that. I mean, with respect to all that's going on, you're telling me the nuclear alert status hasn't changed when Putin allegedly has his family in a bunker somewhere right now in the Siberian mountains. So this is serious, and remember, you're going to be the last to know, because if they came out today and said, hey guys, guess what? Russia's threatening nuclear war and we're at DEFCON 2, which is basically one step away from nuclear war, is imminent, people would panic, people would lose their you-know-what, and the markets would totally crash into free-fall mode, and the government would be able to operate. So they're not going to tell us if it's that bad. Now, do I truly believe that there's going to be a nuclear war? Well, I can tell you, I hope not, and I still lean towards I don't think there is going to be, but we're at a situation right now where it's so precarious. One wrong move, okay, we are so close, and the decisions that are made within the next 48 hours, and possibly longer, depending on how long this thing drags out, are going to determine if the likelihood of that goes up or goes down. Now, that sounds like kind of rhetorical, but I mean, it's worth saying that we are closer in a lot of cases than we've ever been before. Now, what you need to know about what's going to happen within the next 48 hours in Kiev, there's going to be a major siege upon that city, allegedly. It could be a different strategy employed where they just try to starve the city out and they encircle it. And, that's going to be a more drawn out, protracted thing. But there's a big risk in both of those situations, because Ukraine, for better or for worse, is going to have to put artillery and heavy machinery within civilian areas. And as such, if civilians are still in those areas and they're targeted by the Russians, there's going to be lots of civilian deaths as a result of that, unfortunately. And this is going to create a global uproar, as it should, okay? The problem is that there's going to be increasing pressure for NATO to get involved beyond just feeding guerrilla warfare. There's going to be increasing calls to have a no-fly zone enforced by NATO over Ukraine. If you don't know what that is, that's just basically NATO says, the NATO countries say, hey, nobody can fly in this country right now, and if you do, you're violating international law, our law that we just made, and that means that we now have to engage you. And when they engage Russian fighter jets or Russian bombers or whatever the case might be, that's when we've gone potentially not just to DEFCON 2, but I would say getting closer to DEFCON 1. Now, DEFCON 1 is a big leap depending on how you interpret it, because that's when military strategists are going to start thinking about how can we win a nuclear war, and the way we win it is by firing first. And that's a dangerous, dangerous place to be. Now, another observation I had, and this is not a judgment call, this is just me objectively trying to figure out what is going on and how it's going to affect the rest of the world, is that you have a lot of overnight conscripts, okay? People who've been given a rifle and said, hey, go fight for your country with no military experience whatsoever. Overnight, some of them forcefully conscripted. Some of them were, volunteers, okay? People who've never fired a gun in their life. And as much as that's commendable for people who did volunteer to do it, I do think that it carries a lot of risk, because what's potentially going to happen now is a lot of these people with no military training, when they do find themselves up against a trained fighting force, and they are quickly, if not instantly, overwhelmed and put themselves in danger, in real danger. There's a lot of people in the news who are cheering this on with no consideration for the reality that they're potentially walking these people into. And what I would hope to see in this is we minimize human suffering in the best way we can. Now, if there's probably arguments to be made that that's the best way to minimize human suffering is to try to fend them off. But there's many arguments to say that, it's almost just a matter of time before the Russians take over the city. So is it worth putting those people in a situation and giving them false confidence, okay? And I'm not here to say that it's not possible. It's definitely possible. Anything's possible. But I think when they're up against a trained fighting force, the reality is going to be much different. There's another risk of all of this is that if and when that does happen, the media of the world is going to say, look, we need to do more about this. And you could make an argument that we do need to do more. But the powers that be know that this is a big game of chicken right now with Vladimir Putin and Russian upper top brass. And the game of chicken is all about, well, who's going to get close enough to pushing the button without pushing it? I think Russia is now at a position where it has no choice but to go all the way. That there is no choice, especially for Putin, because there is a distinct possibility, and I heard someone talking about this yesterday, that if he loses this, if he loses control of the country, that, he could be Gaddafi'd. That could potentially be what happens to him. His countrymen could turn on him, and I think he knows it. Now, there is some talk that Putin is hiding his family in a bunker in the Siberian mountains. Now, the source for that story is some Russian professor. I can't attest to the validity of it, although it wouldn't be surprising. Apparently, the Russians have underground cities, bunkers for all the elites that they're going to go and retreat to. I don't know what they're going to emerge to or what they're going to come up to. It's hard to say what's really going on at this point, but the United States has ruled out enforcing a no-fly zone on Russian aircraft over Ukraine. However, that it's being talked about is worrisome, because that means there's a good chance that we're going to be pulled in. Now, I would say that if they start talking about sending even more troops over, then, that's when you should have that bug-out bag ready at the door. Now, Belarus is going to host nuclear weapons, or at least the stage is set for them to now host nuclear weapons. And that means that Russia is going to be able to have its nukes right up against Western Europe, essentially. Not that that makes a huge difference in terms of time, but in terms of actually winning a nuclear war, a few minutes does count. Japan has also considered hosting nuclear weapons. Now, whether this is just in response to the Belarus thing, I'm not sure. But what you need to understand is that both the United States and Russia have a policy. If they are losing a conventional war, there is a threshold upon which they will use nuclear weapons as a deterrent. Now, fortunately, in this situation, I don't think NATO is ever going to encroach onto Russian borders. Russia may get beat in Ukraine, and let's hope that that would be the end of it. However, if Russia perceives losing Ukraine as being an existential threat to itself, which it probably does because Zelensky was asking for nukes and Zelensky wants to get into the EU. So there is a chance that they view it as an existential threat and that it would escalate in that way. So there has been questions about why is Russia sending young troops? Why is Russia suffering all these losses? Why do half the troops seem to not know why they're there in the first place? Is this just what they're told to say if they get caught? Who knows? Is it that Russia is just sending in its weaker links first to kind of smoke out the Ukrainians and get them to exhaust their anti-tank missile supplies on these older tanks that are rolling in, save the Spetsnaz types, the vets, for later. Who knows? Who knows what the actual plan is right now? But we should all know that I don't think Russia has any problems throwing human life at the problem. I mean, they're kind of notorious for that. A lot of people are saying there's some logistical failure around what's going on with Russia. And I mean, that would be a pretty big failure considering you completely surround the country and you're only that far from the border. So it makes me wonder what is really going on. Is there some weird Machiavellian plan that Putin is trying to execute? Or is it just that they were a little bit rushed in their planning because they seen that support for Ukraine was ratcheting up and they didn't want as many weapons leaking in there? That could potentially be what's going on. Now, this whole 40-mile convoy going into Kiev right now, some speculate that it's an attempt to try to take the head off the snake, okay, to get Zelensky. And some people say, well, that's not going to be sufficient enough to quell Ukrainian resistance. In fact, that might actually create a martyr. Then it might be worse because then you might have different groups within the country who are maybe unified under Zelensky starting to vie for power together, and then it's going to be balkanized and all that. One official said that after the government in Kiev is dismantled, there will be no one opposition within Ukraine for us to support militarily. So your options would be supporting one radical faction or another. Now, what I think we're going to start seeing in Russia pretty soon is a lot of resistance, because people are going to start feeling the pinch of the financial squeeze of all of these sanctions, investors being wiped out, the cost of everything is going to grow up. Now, the one thing that Russia has going for it is that it's largely self-sufficient. So it can probably keep people fed, it can probably keep people satiated, but people are still going to be pissed. And it might not even be something that comes from the grassroots, from like a people's movement type thing. It could actually be something that happens within Putin's circle. There's a coup d'etat or something to that effect. That could happen. And I think Putin is probably worried about that. And that could even make him a little bit more hair-triggered when it comes to the nuclear button. Now, a lot of people have been asking me personally what China's role is in all of this, and what do I know? I'm not an expert on this issue. But the best summary that I've heard is that in Chinese diplomatic circles, there is an unspoken view that an economically weak but militarily aggressive Russia suits China the best. Russia's military operations also draw attention away from Beijing. So China basically needs Russia to be a buffer to NATO in the same way that Russia wants Ukraine to be a buffer to NATO. And this is one of the reasons why China will never allow NATO to get established. Because remember, there's people who probably want to take over Russia within NATO. And I mean that in an economic subversion sense. Possibly even more than that, because Russia is a country which is rich in minerals and resources, and they have a high production capacity. They're very well established in an industrial sense, so you can't tell me that there's not somebody somewhere who doesn't want that regime to collapse so that, you know, corporations can go in there and start making more money. That's just a fact of life, folks. So in Europe, average fuel prices have reached the highest level on record. Government figures show a cost of liter of petrol has hit $1.49 per pint after oil prices soared to an 8-year high following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I do believe that that's only the beginning of the oil price hike. Gold is up once again, by the way. And what this means is that Russia is likely going to start to counter back and restrict its outflows of gas, food, and what other minerals and resources that it provides Europe and the rest of the world that it's now warring with. However, it doesn't want to be dependent on China, because if it's solely dependent on China, and that's what China wants, then China can pay a low price, a much, much lower price, and they'll have no other choice because they have to feed the war machine somehow. So that's what's going on in Europe. Now, in terms of the refugee crisis, we don't even know what the extent of that is going to be. But if there's this extensive bombardment of Kiev and people start seeing that on TV, it's quickly going to swell into the millions. In fact, the UN estimates that there could be as many as 4 million Ukrainian refugees if current trends continue. And you got to think too how destabilizing that's going to be to the receiving countries, and how much of a bigger economic drag it's going to be on those countries after you factor in all the increased costs of living that are going to follow, that are going to result from this. Now, of course, this means that the other countries are going to start turning up the tap and hopefully exporting more oil and natural gas. But that sort of thing takes time. And remember that Russia and Ukraine are major food exporters, okay? Russia and Ukraine combined export the following, okay? 50% of sunflower seeds and everything that you make from sunflower seeds. About 18% of all wheat. About 24% of all barley. 24% of linseed. About 14% of corn. They're exporting that primarily to developing countries. If those developing countries can't get that, that's going to create instability, which is going to be a breeding ground for radical movements, which of course are going to overflow into your living room at some point or another. Now, another global repercussion of this is potentially that Russia is going to start defaulting on its loans. Okay, so Russia, just like any other country, owes billions and billions of dollars. And if they're unable to pay those loans, or they just say, well, screw you, you know, you've cut us out of everything else, we're just not going to pay, then there's going to be a lot of companies on the line. So that is going to have a negative economic impact, no matter how you slice it. With the exception of oil and energy and people who have investments in that, a war with Russia is not good for the economy, unless you're investing in Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, or other weapons manufacturers. But for the general economy as a whole, it's not going to be a good thing, at least in the short term. It's only a good thing insofar as it's a distraction from everybody else. All the politicians get to say, hey, look, we're so much better than that bad guy over there. And even if you're one of the worst politicians ever, it's so easy by contrast to appear like a saint. So, and they're all milking it because they know that they're all on the line for what's happened in the last 2 years, and a lot of people didn't like the restrictions, and they're hoping that people are going to forget and get all starry-eyed and just forget about all the bad decisions that they've made and hopefully re-elect them. This is going to be good for the tar sands in Canada. They're probably going to see an uptick in Canadian tar sand crude output, which means that if you want to go work on the rigs, it's probably a good time to sign up. I'm sure you'll make some money the way that oil prices are expected to escalate. And what else do I have to share with you guys? I think that's about it for today. I'm going to be interviewing Arthur Bradley again. We're going to talk about the EMP threat in light of recent events, because there is definitely a threat of EMP. And one of the threats of EMP, people say, well, why would they use an EMP when we're talking about nuclear stuff? The reason why EMP, or electromagnetic pulse, if you don't know, that's when you detonate a nuclear warhead up in the upper atmosphere, and it basically disables the electronics and a line of sight, a very wide radius, could take out the whole eastern seaboard of power, not kill anyone right away. And that's why it would be a potentially useful tool in this case if you were Russia, because you'd be thinking to yourself, maybe they wouldn't respond with a nuke if we did this, but it would totally cripple their system. And the reason why I say you might not respond with a nuke is because it'd be hard to justify from public opinion perspective nuking another country if they didn't nuke you first. So we'd have to do something back which was equal in size, and what would probably happen is we might do the same, or we might just go right to the nukes, because we know that after we did them, the next thing they're going to do is probably fire a nuke. So yeah, it's just not going to end well anyways, guys. We're going to talk about it more tomorrow. I still don't think that our leaders and even Putin himself is that crazy, but if Putin feels backed into a corner, man, and if he feels that it's do or die, hopefully there's some generals and top brass that are going to tackle him and, you know, make sure that he can't make that move if it comes down to it. I don't think that he's that crazy, to be honest. I don't think anybody's that crazy, but you just never know. You just never know. And we're at a point right now where more accidents can happen is the problem. It's not so much that even there's going to be a madman play here. It's more so that when you start getting this close to pushing the button, mistakes can get made. We can think that they're doing something when they're really not. When you're on heightened alert, you're likely to see more threats. And the first response to those threats is to blow our load, right? In a way which is not going to be fun for anyone. Anyways, guys, let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below, and just keep watch because the situation could get hot any minute now. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.